What if building self-serve webhooks for your customers was as easy as sending other types of notifications? If your product serves developers or a technical audience, building an event-driven webhook feature is probably somewhere on your roadmap. But to do this right, you'll need to consider security and signing keys, implement a retry mechanism on failed requests, and create a way for developers to test and debug their webhook connections from inside your product. With Knock's notification primitives, you can leverage tested notification infrastructure to help you build this feature. In this video, we'll walk through an example app that shows you how to model webhook connections in Knock using objects, test event payloads using a workflow with a webhook channel step, and debug webhook connections using the message delivery log API. This example app is built using Next.js and shadcn UI, but the pattern should be applicable to whatever your development target is. So let's get started. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started. And I have open here a page from the Knock documentation on building customer-facing webhooks. And so what we'll do in this video is loosely walk through these steps while also following the steps outlined in this example app that you can get to via this call out right here. Now that's contained in this GitHub repository. And so we'll get started by cloning that, which I've already done. And then we can go ahead and provide some of the environment variables that we'll need to run the project locally. So if I hop over into VS Code, the first thing that I'm going to do is go ahead and make a copy of my env.sample file into .env.local. And if we open up that file, we can see some of the values that we need. The first one is obviously our Knock API key. And so we'll get that from the Knock dashboard in API keys. And I can just go ahead and copy that secret key. We'll need the secret key since we're really just using the server-side SDKs for this project. So we'll go ahead, copy and paste that in there. Then the next thing that we'll need is our webhook channel ID. And so if I come up here to integrations, come down to webhook, really all that we need for this environment variable is this channel ID. So let's go ahead and drop that in there right now. Give it a save, and then we'll hop back in and take a look at the configuration for that channel. So if we come back out to the guide, we'll see that configuring this HTTP channel, also known as a webhook channel, is our first step. And so if we hop into here, there's a couple of things that we can do. Let's go to edit webhook and see what that looks like. So the first thing that we're doing is we're passing this URL. We're going to give it a liquid variable. So it's going to look at the recipient of the workflow trigger and then look for a URL property on that recipient to populate the URL. So we're not hard coding a URL. This is going to be dynamic for each recipient or object that we use to trigger a webhook request. And then if we look at the body, we can see what we're passing in here. We have this JSON object that we're recreating. And so we've got this type key, and then we're passing in this event type value from the data payload. We're also using this timestamp here. And then we're also just getting an additional payload from what your application passes in, right? And so we'll look at what that looks like in the code, but we're using this JSON filter to serialize it to JSON so that we can do that. So that's what the webhook configuration looks like. And then there's also one other step. If we want to enable webhook signature verification, we need to enable this option and then provide it either a static or dynamic signing key. So if you wanted to provide one value for the signing key, you could do that. But again, since we're building customer-facing webhooks and each customer is going to have their own signing key, we're actually going to pass it a liquid variable like this so that we're going to look at the recipient, find the signing key property on that recipient, and then use that value to sign this request. That's important because, again, your customer is going to use that value in their own application to process that request from the webhooks, make sure that it's valid before they do anything with it. So if you want to enable signature verification, you do that on this manage configuration step. So we'll go ahead and just update that even though we didn't make any changes, and that's all good. So let's hop back into VS Code and see what other values we need. So here we have a webhook collection a workflow key, and then a tenant ID. So we'll go grab these values really quickly. Tenant ID, I'm going to actually grab a different tenant. So we'll say, Knock projects 876 is going to be my tenant for this project. And this is just a nice way of segmenting some of the messages. So as you go and you sort of implement your own customer-facing webhook setup, I would recommend using tenants as a part of this. Obviously, you probably have some concept of organizations in your own application, and that's what tenants map to. So the next thing that we'll do is we're going to create an object collection, and I think we'll just create one, a new one, right? And so we don't have one, so we'll call this webhooks test, and then the key of my webhook workflow is webhook event stream. So let's go look at what that looks like really quickly before we deep dive into the rest of the application. So we can see that I've got this workflow called webhook event stream. There's the key that I'm using as a part of my environment variables. And this is actually a very simple workflow. All we're doing is we're using an API trigger to trigger this workflow. And then we have this one webhook step. And we have a condition on this webhook step where we're looking at the recipient.events property, and we're making sure that it contains the data event type that we're passing in. So basically what we're going to do as we model out these webhook connections is we'll create an object to model our recipient, and we'll store certain events that we want to send webhooks about when those events are triggered. Then when we trigger those events and pass in an event type, Knock will automatically look at the allowed events on this webhook connection, make sure that it contains the current event that we're triggering before sending that notification. And then if we look at this real quick, we'll see that, this stuff all looks the same. Now, it is important to note that if you do specify some values here on the individual step, it's going to override the template that we created in the integrations tab. So just kind of keep that in mind, that you can sort of change these, or you can have maybe one more global configuration in the integrations tab and then override individual HTTP steps with those templates. Okay, so that's great. We've got everything configured that we need to run this application. So that's really the next step, is to come down here, go ahead and click npm run dev to start up our local server. Then we'll go ahead and open that in Chrome. And you should see a page that looks like this. Awesome. So now that we have our application running, let's go ahead and add an endpoint. And so I have open here my HookDeck dashboard. HookDeck is a reliable event gateway for asynchronous applications. It's a service that helps you receive, process, and deliver messages across your architecture. And so we'll be using it today to ingest some messages from our webhooks. Here, I have a source created that gives me this URL. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this, and this is where we're going to send our webhook event. So we'll go ahead and click add endpoint. We'll just go ahead and call this, HookDeck. And then we'll add in this URL. And we'll say this is a HookDeck URL. Okay, and then we've got our signing key here, which is automatically generated for us. And again, this is what you would want your customer to use in their own application to verify that signature. And then down here, we also have the different types of events that we can subscribe to on this webhook endpoint. So I'm going to go ahead and just leave all of these on for now, and then we'll go ahead and click submit, and we can see that that was created successfully. And then if we come back to our dashboard page, we can see our endpoint right there. But let's go check Knock and see what happened, and then dig into the application a little bit. So here you can see I've got my objects tab pulled up. I've got this drop down here that allows me to explore my different object collections. And if I come down, we'll see that I now have this webhooks test collection, and I have that HookDeck webhook in there. And when we create an object, we also have the option to specify different properties on it. So, and that's exactly what we did here, right? We created an object using the collection and an ID, and then we added all of these custom properties onto that object. So we've got our description there that we're using to create this interface. We've got our different events that we stored in an array so that we can reference them during that workflow run. We stored our signing key under the signing key property and the URL under the URL property, so that as we use that recipient.url or recipient.signing key in our liquid variables, Knock's going to know where to grab those things. So that's in essence where objects are stored in the Knock dashboard and sort of how they work. But let's dig into the code a little bit and figure out how we've gone about doing that. So if we open up our app folder and we come down into, I believe, this dashboard page right here, we can see that this is sort of where we're adding those endpoints, and we're using this endpoint new page component to actually create that. So here we're just sort of doing this, and we've got this set endpoint form, which is down in our components folder. So if we open that up, we can sort of see what that looks like, and we'll scroll down past a bunch of the UI stuff. Here we've just defined some schema using Zod, the ID, endpoint, URL, description, all of the things that we're storing as those custom properties. And then basically we've got a form down here that, allows you to set those values. And then we're going to call a server action called set endpoint object. And so this is where Knock actually sort of takes over, and where we're actually using some of these SDK methods on the Knock API. So we're importing the Knock library, and then we're using this objects.set method where we're passing in a collection ID, and then we're stringifying basically an ID for the webhook. And so this is how you identify objects inside of Knock. Objects live in a collection, and they have a unique ID. So that's what we're telling Knock to do is, hey, for this ID inside of this collection, I want you to set these properties. And essentially that's what we do right here, right? We're passing in the name, we're passing in description, URL, all of the things that we need. And so that's what allows us to essentially store all of that data in Knock, sort of have this nice self-contained entity with all of the things that you'll need to process a webhook request. And so that's step one. And if we hop back out into the browser and go through our guide, I do want to call out sort of one difference between the way that I've created this example app and what we see here. Here we have objects and subscriptions to power webhooks, where here we're just using objects. Now what subscriptions allow you to do is to sort of add another layer of hierarchy on top of this data model that you create in Knock. So here, for example, as we walk through these steps, you can see that we're creating essentially a projects object collection. And then we have these project webhooks, another collection called project webhooks that stores those webhook entities. And then we subscribe that project webhooks collection to the projects collection. So essentially you're mapping a project to a project webhook. And then when we invoke the workflow for a project, it will fan out to all of its subscribers. So that's a very powerful functionality in Knock that you should definitely explore. We just decided to simplify it a little bit for this example app so that we weren't needing to create so many collections. But it also gives you a lot of flexibility in how you want to model your data and how you want to go about alerting people when these webhook events happen. So that's just one thing I wanted to call out. Now let's head back in and look at how we would go about testing and triggering this workflow from the application. So here we already have our endpoint set. And if we wanted to update anything about it, we can do that using that little grip icon. But let's come over here to events and let's select this hook deck webhook to send an event to. And if we go ahead and we click server alert and submit, we can see that, all right, our test event was sent. And if we come over here to hook deck, click into requests, we can see that, boom, that request just came through. Here's the payload that we sent off. We sent this server alert, and then we sent this message, this timestamp, all of that stuff that we did in our workflow body comes through there. So now that's how we would test this. And ideally, if you're creating customer facing webhooks, you would want some interface like this where they can actually test those connections, make sure that they're working. You can even see there that in the toast, it prompted me to go check the logs, which we can go do over here. And there we get the logs. So before we dig into the logs, let's actually dive into the code a little bit and look at what happens. So there we've got just another form that we've created, this test event form. We've got some form schema there that we've created using Zod, and then basically a very simple form where we basically select, the webhook destination, and then we map through the different events, create different checkboxes for those so we can select which event we want to test. But let's hop up into the server action that gets invoked when we do that. And we'll see that this is pretty much just a basic workflow trigger. So here we're importing again the Knock SDK. Then we're awaiting this workflow.trigger call, where we're passing in as the first argument the workflow key, right? We're telling it which workflow we want to trigger. And then as the recipient, we're passing in that object. So that object, again, that syntax is that it needs an ID and a collection. So we're saying, hey, for this webhook ID, this is the ID, and then the collection we get from our environment variables. And then we're passing in two other pieces of information. This data key takes basically your data payload, right? So we're passing in the event type, the payload, and then we're reconstructing some of that stuff inside of our webhook template. And then lastly, we're passing in this tenant. And again, using the tenant is probably a good idea here because you want these tied to a specific organization. It just makes it easier to retrieve the data that you need to reconstruct the logs and stuff like that. If you've associated these requests with a particular tenant, and if you're building something sophisticated enough to need customer facing webhooks, you probably have the concept of organizations or groups or something like that that would represent tenants in this case. So that's really all we're doing. We're triggering a workflow just like we would in any other fashion using Knock. And that's what makes this so easy, is it's the same syntax that you would use to send any other type of notification, but we can do that to send this webhook request. So let's hop back into the browser real quick. And let's go out to workflows and let's take a look at our webhook event stream logs. So here we can see, that we made this post to trigger that workflow. And if we go to workflow runs, we can look at this workflow run that we sent to this hook deck recipient. And here we can actually begin to sort of step through what's happened. So we see the trigger. This is the data that got passed in as a payload. Here are the details about the recipient's preferences, which we're not using in this case. But if we click into the actual webhook step, here we can see even more details, right? So here we're actually looking at that condition evaluation. So where we looked at the event stored on the hook deck recipient, we looked at the event type that we passed in, and we basically made that evaluation, right? Does recipient events, this array, contain this string? And it does, so it processes, and then we generate this message. And we can see here all of the different requests that we made and look at some of those really interesting things. And if we hop down here into logs, we can see, the response that we got back from HookDeck, the request. So all of these really interesting details and things that we might need to build into our own customer-facing applications so that they can debug those things for themselves. So let's look at how we do that in the next step. All right. So in this last step, what we'll look at is how to build this sort of customer-facing message log experience. So we can see that I have this table right here that basically just has the event type, the message ID, timestamp, and then its message status. Okay. And then we've got this other layer down here that we can dig into where we can look at some of those details that I just showed you in the Knock logs. And so let's look at how we've done that with code. And so if I hop back out here, we come down into logs, we'll go to this logs list page. And that's essentially what we're doing to collect those logs. We are looking at the messages that have been sent. Then we use a couple of these different values to narrow down those messages that we've sent from Knock, right? So we import the Knock SDK, configure it with the API key. Then we use knock.messages.list to get a list of the messages that have been processed for this particular tenant from that particular workflow and sent via that particular channel, right? And so again, this all could be a little bit different based on your use case, but this got me very close to the experience that I would want to create for my users using those three things. So we're looking at messages sent to a particular tenant from a particular workflow on a particular channel. So again, you might not need all this depending on how you set it up, and maybe just the workflow, the workflow key or the channel ID is enough to get you there. But here I just felt like including them just to be certain that I was getting the right look at the logs that I wanted. And then we're just using those messages to map through and create a table row. And again, we're not including all of the detail in the messages. We're just sort of giving our user, if we go back into Google Chrome, enough to get an overview of what they might need to dig in deeper, especially this message status, which could be undelivered. And here we can see this one's delivered. So let's dig into the message details and see what that looks like. So this is actually digging one layer deeper into an API that is called the message delivery logs. And so here we can see that we're doing that, and we don't actually have a method on the SDK at the moment to do that. We're looking to add that for the next version of them. So I just created this quick function that uses the REST API to grab those delivery logs using the message ID that I already have. And then down here, we're just using this to create some more interesting interfaces that allow developers to dig in. So here we're actually pulling out the request body so that you can inspect basically what got sent. So that's kind of neat. We've got this nice little JSON viewer here. And then if we come back over here, we can see, if we scroll down, we're actually looking through the different items. So inside of each delivery log is a list of items, and these basically correspond to the different attempts that Knock has made to contact that downstream service. So in this instance, there was only one request sent because we got a successful 200 response. And so we can dig into that and actually look at the request that was, the response that was sent back from HookDeck and all the headers and all of the different things that were sent along with that request that I might need to troubleshoot this on my own. Now, to show a different example of how this would fail, let's head back out to our endpoints and let's add a new endpoint. We're going to call this Jeff's WordPress site. And then this is going to be, okay. And so this is just should hit an endpoint on my website. And if we copy and paste this into a new tab, when we make a GET request to this, we should see basically it brings back all my posts, which is what we want. But it should require some authentication to make a post request to that endpoint. So what we should see is when we use this webhook, we should get an error. So we'll go ahead and just give this a quick description and go ahead and submit it. And we'll go ahead and check that that was created. All right. And then if we come back here and test another event, we'll send this off to my WordPress site. We'll send a server alert. We'll go ahead and click submit. Amazing. And that was sent. And so let's go ahead and click view logs. All right. And there we can see that we have a different status now. So delivery attempted. And if we hop back out into the logs, let's go back and look at what's happening in Knock while we do this. There we got our new one. Let's go workflow runs. And then let's click into this channel step. And here we can see that this status is still delivery attempted. And we've only got this one associated activity with it. So let's look at the delivery logs there. And here we can actually see that Knock, when it receives anything other than a 200 response or 200x response, that it's going to retry that request using some exponential backoff. So we get all of these different attempts. Each one we can use to look at the response from that downstream service to help us determine what we as developers might need to do next. So here, if we dig into this, we can see all of those different responses. And eventually, once it goes through the allowed number of retries, basically, it will change the message status to undelivered instead of delivery attempted. So again, this is really helpful, and you can sort of see how this would be more helpful in the case of a failed request, where I can look at, okay, well, I gave it this endpoint, I sent this request. Why is my webhook not working the way that I want it to? And here we can see, REST cannot create error code. Sorry, you're not allowed to create this post as this user, right? Because I haven't passed in any of the authentication needed to do that to this downstream API. Thanks for watching. Hopefully you have a better understanding of how to create customer-facing webhooks and a deeper appreciation for how flexible Knock's abstractions are. In this video, we looked at how to model webhook connections, how to test webhook events with workflows, and how to use message delivery logs to provide developers with the information that they need to troubleshoot connections on their own. While Knock isn't specifically a webhook delivery platform, it's well suited for this use case and allows your development team to introduce an entire feature set using the same patterns they'd use to send notifications to any other channel. If you have any questions about designing your webhook feature, feel free to comment on this video or join our Slack community to continue the conversation. Thanks for watching, and knock on.